with that, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Marya Hornbacher. Marya Hornbacher is an award-winning essayist, journalist, novelist, poet, and the international best-selling author of 5 books, including Wasted, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and the New York Times bestseller Madness. She is the recipient of the Annie Dillard Award for Nonfiction, a Logan Fellowship for Social Justice Journalism, the White Award for Magazine Journalism, the ASCAP Award for Music Journalism, the Fountain House Humanitarian Award, and other distinctions. Her writing has appeared in publications including the New York Times, Boston Globe, Smithsonian Magazine, Crazy Horse, Agni, Gulf Coast, The Normal School, Fourth Genre, Diagram, Arts and Letters, and many others. And she is currently at work on her 6th and 7th books, a work of long-form journalism and a collection of essays. Oh my goodness, you are certainly prolific. Amazing. Please take it away and share your screen when you are ready to present. And welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and thank you to everybody at She Recovers. I really appreciate you having me here today. Sorry about the little flail here. There was this blow behind me and it looked way too angelic for my taste. So I moved so you can see the kitchen instead. Anyway, it is wonderful to be here today. My name is Marya, and thanks to those of you who have joined us from whatever platform you have joined us from. That was a grammatical disaster. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and let's see if I can do this correctly. Portion of screen, and we're going to look at a couple of these slides. This is how this works with me. Those of you who've been to my talks before will know that I come wildly over-prepared and then regularly depart from everything I have thought I would say, but that's just how it goes sometimes. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really kind of broadly speaking, and I do want to give a couple of caveats about this. I'm talking about gender from the point of view of a cis woman who is not obviously particularly able to speak to the experiences of anything other than a cis female identified woman. So I just want to be aware and respectful of the fact that I don't represent anybody else's experience of gender. I can't speak to anybody else's experience of gender. What I can speak to is the fact that we're all in a culture, we all carry cultural baggage with us. A lot of times it's been my observation, both in my own life and in that of other people in recovery, gender is walking around with me, whether I'm aware of it or not. My deeply embedded, sometimes impacted ideas about my own gender, other people's gender, what gender means, what gender does, how it interacts with my own life. Often those assumptions are unexamined. And for me, it has been pretty critical to examine the assumptions I carry with me about my own gender and how it plays a role in my recovery, and the assumptions that other people may have about me as well. So onward, caveats being what they are. I also want to add that when I speak of recovery, as Dawn said, I'm speaking about recovery very, very broadly speaking. I myself have experience with addiction recovery, trauma recovery, not recovering from things that I should be recovering from. I mean, we're all pretty human. And so recovery can be very broadly defined. When I talk about recovery communities, those two are, I'd like to speak about those as broadly defined. I'm not speaking specifically of any one recovery community, but of people who I'd say are endeavoring to recover from the stuff that we've all got. So first, starting off, gender identity and recovery. I think a lot of people, this is how I got started thinking about this. I'd been in recovery from various addictions for a pretty long period of time, and I was speaking in a recovery meeting about a certain amount of frustration that I had as what I often am is the only woman in the room, or one of very few women in a recovery room. That's not everybody's experience, but it has been mine. It may be regional in part. But I was speaking to the fact that I get very tired of being the woman in the room who pipes up and says, all of this recovery literature is super great, super interesting, totally irrelevant to my experience. And then people get cross with me and they're like, but we have to all agree. I'm like, we definitely don't all have to agree about anything. It's actually fine for me to disagree with everything you're saying to me, and I can still recover. And you can still recover even though I don't agree with you. So, somebody came up to me after that meeting and informed me quite ferociously and standing above me as if to make me feel even smaller. He said, I want you to understand that in recovery, there is no race, there is no gender, there is no age. And I said, that's super interesting that a middle-aged white dude just told me that there's no race, no gender, and no age in this particular community. And I'm like, okay, so that's your experience, because your experience of it is that of your experience being universal and universally applicable. That has not been my experience, sir. And so we got in a bit of a spat. And I just sort of, I didn't want to get in a spat, but I also do get very tired of having to say, there is no universality. The assumption of universality in experience is fundamentally racist, sexist, homophobic, and all the other things, right? So if I assume my experience is universal, that means I'm assuming all white women's experience applies to everybody else's experience, and everything I've learned can be useful to somebody else. That's not true. Not everything I know is applicable to everybody else. Not everything I've learned is applicable to everybody else. A lot of people wouldn't even find my experience terribly interesting, and I don't blame them. So that said, I have found myself ready to say, okay, what are the assumptions that are being thrown at me, but also what are my assumptions that I'm walking around with, assuming everybody else really has got a lot to learn from what I have to say. A lot of the things I have to say aren't useful to everybody. What I can say is that the process of examining the assumptions I have about gender and the role it has played in my various addictions and in my recovery, the examination process, I do believe to be, if not universally useful, then perhaps at least informative, because the people I know who recover really, really beautifully do so because they are examining both the world that they live in and their own role in it. They are examining both the things that have happened to them and the things that they have done. There's a lot of dimension to it. So gender identity and recovery here to this slide, it's really just a matter of identifying not what is my gender, how do I identify as a gendered person, but really what are the ways in which the way I live interact with the way I interact with the world. So onward, core identity, gender, it's not fixed. At least I do not believe it to be fixed. I believe it to be fluid. I believe it to be largely campy and costumey, but I also do move in the world as someone who is visibly a woman, visibly not mistaken for another gender ever. I'm never misgendered. I'm never identified as something other than what I also hold myself to be. So the disconnect between what I present to the world and what I feel myself to be isn't something I have to struggle with. People who identify as genders other than they present as, or who identify as a person who does not prefer a gender, who prefers a they, them pronoun, or who does not identify with a single gender at all. They're dealing with a huge number of layers of frustration within the culture that I don't have to deal with. So I cannot speak to their experience, but I want to identify the fact that it's easy for me to walk into a room and say, I'm a woman and nobody argues with me. That makes it easy for me to pass in some ways. That, that's a privilege that I operate with. That said, it also means that in every room I walk into, I am facing all of the misogynistic and gynophobic stuff that we all know about, right? Like that's not news to anybody. So, it's not a matter of who is struggling more. It's a matter of all of us present in one way or another and are taken and interact socially in one way or the other. Some of the ways in which we identify who we are as people are gendered. I was born in 1974, so my core identity was shaped in part by assumptions that I had about being a girl, what it meant to be a girl, what a good girl was supposed to do, what a good girl was supposed to say. I can tell you right now, I was very bad at being a girl. I didn't do it well. I didn't do it right. I didn't want to dress. I didn't want to play with dolls. And so all of these supposed tos, I've been bad at them from go. And I fully appreciate that actually about my experience. The fact that I was bad at being a girl doesn't mean I didn't want to be good at it. I really did want to be good at girling, and I never did get good at it, but I tried really hard. And so the ways in which I was soaking up cultural information about what it meant to be female or a girl or a woman, all of those things got deeply embedded in my system, just as they do for everybody else's. And I did not question those things as much as perhaps I should have until I was older. By the time I was an addict of one kind or another, not only was I deeply identified with, I am a woman, I am bad at being a woman, I was a wife and bad at being a wife, I was a bad daughter, I was bad at being a girl in school, I was bad at things girls were supposed to be good at, it was blah, 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 blah. So all of these value-laden judgments about gender were already impacted in my identity to begin with. Furthermore, I was pretty clearly swayed by the idea that I was a train wreck girl. I was a drama queen. I was I was all sorts of gendered crazy. The ways in which I was crazy, and I say that word just to a point with quotes, the ways in which I was crazy and the ways in which I was told I was crazy were gendered in their own right. So for example, many of you may have experienced this. You walk into a psychiatrist's office, you say, yes, I'm sleeping with somebody. And they say, well, are you promiscuous? And I'm like, do you ever ask boys that? Do you ever ask your male clients if they are promiscuous? I'm just wondering. And they don't, but here we are. So I'm like, well, golly, am I promiscuous? And golly, am I, and so all of these questions, I did not question the questions for a long, long time. I didn't question the nature of my addictions, many of which were heavily gendered, heavily sexually, sort of sexually laden. And, the substance abuse issues that I dealt with got very wrapped up in, I was the drunk girl. How many country songs have you heard about drunk girls don't cry, whatever? I was for sure the drunk girl. I was the girl tipping over on my high heels. So there was never a time at which my addictions were separable from my idea and my identity of who I was as a gendered human being. There was never a point at which that wasn't the case. So I'm saying all this not because my experience is yours, but simply to raise the question of, in your experience of mental health concerns, addiction concerns, behavioral concerns, whatever, how are those concerns in your life overlaid and informed and shaped by your concept of gender, of what your gender is, was, will be, what you wanted it to be? Is there a disconnect between your gender and whatever we think we're supposed to be doing? So it's not that my experience is universal. It's not even that it's terribly interesting. I raise these things simply to say, are there ways in which your idea of yourself as a person with mental health problems or struggles or in need of recovery, whatever brings us here, are there ways in which those are gendered in your life? And are there ways in which you are perhaps, as I certainly have and continue to in some ways, proceeding from an assumption that there is a correct way to be your gender and you're doing it wrong? And so onward. Bias and belief, gender bias is both covert and overt. When people look at me and talk to me as a woman, well, that's gender bias. That's gender bias. And it informs our beliefs. Bias about who I am, who you are informed by assumptions that we may or may not be able to articulate at any given time. But every room I walk into it as a woman. And every conversation I have, I'm having it with somebody who sees me as a woman. And that isn't always a helpful assumption for me or them. It may not have any material impact at all, but we're all fully aware that, in the world that we live in, bias influences the way we interact. It also influences the way we behave. There are plenty of ways in which I could say, well, it's really a hassle that I'm making 70 cents on the dollar or whatever, but there are also ways in which, people take advantage also. We participate in the privileges and in the disadvantages that we have to some extent, right? Not all of us, not in every way, but I think there's something to be noted about the fact that the conscious and unconscious assumptions that we carry with us play a role in how we think of our mental health lives and how we think of our recovery. So if I walk into a recovery community and somebody says to me, there's no such thing as gender in this room, and I'm like, super cool, then I'm sure it'll be fine if I just start talking about how hard it is to have PMS and try and recover. I'm sure all the white dudes in here will be super comfortable if I do that, right? You're good. So or if I just start fanning myself these days with a hot flash, I'm like, wow, hot in here, isn't it? All these dudes are like, what am I going to do? I'm like, you'll recover. It's fine. So anyway, onward, the influence of our beliefs on our behavior is often subtle. It's often more nuanced than we think. So before recovery, the behaviors that I have are influenced by beliefs. So when I'm asking myself before I go into recovery, what's the matter with me? I start listening to all of these chanting psychiatrists, and somehow all the chanting psychiatrists in my head are men, which is fine. They aren't all men, but they're chanting and they're in there and they're saying, are you promiscuous? And how much are you drinking these days, young lady and miss, and all of this stuff. So all of these gendered interactions that I have with people, I soak those in. And if I don't question them, I respond to them as if they're valid questions. If somebody says to me, are you promiscuous? And I respond at all, I'm acting as if that's a valid question when in fact it's just garbage and it's just somebody else wanting to know something about me that's none of their business. So when I ask myself, what's wrong with me? What do I compare that to? If I say to myself, well, I'm not married, I don't have kids, what's wrong with me? Does it have to do with the fact that I have mental health conditions? Does it have to do with the fact that I have addiction issues? Does it have to do with the fact that, what if it's just that I don't like dating? What if it's just that I don't like men? You know, I mean, what if it's something really awful? Like, what if it's something really like the society we're in is set up to be really crappy for a lot of different people? And I just stopped participating. Like, what if that's what's wrong with me? But that doesn't fly, let me tell you, in a psychiatrist's office all the time. So the questions have to be questioned in some ways. So before recovery, if I go, well, you know, everybody says I should be living this way, I'm not living this way, that must mean I'm broken or flawed. These days, I don't answer it that way. These days I go, well, the system is broken and flawed. To what extent do I even want to bother with the system? I'm just curious, because like, not that much. I don't want to bother with it all that much anymore. So, but the language I use also has to be examined. And if I think to myself, I'm just a crazy girl, I'm just, you know, I have this disorder, I have that disorder. How many layers of gendered expectation and assumption am I walking through when I emerge with this idea of who's the broken rag doll that I'm presenting to the world by the end of that little mental process? Because I don't see myself as a rag doll, but I did. And this isn't to say that all systems of recovery and all recovery helping professions are flawed or failed. It is to say that they are predisposed to see, I can speak only from my own experience here. They are predisposed to see women in recovery as crazy, as hormonal, as excessive, as this, that, or the other diagnosis, as differently ill than their male counterparts. To say nothing of people who do not identify with the gender, where they haven't even finished developing stereotypes for people who are non-binary yet. So I'm sure that'll go well. Anyway, the question for that is, whose voices am I listening to and how much am I letting them influence what I believe about myself and my recovery? So behavior and belief into recovery. The question that becomes fundamental when I move toward recovery out of a state of being in a pretty bad spot, whatever that spot is about, the question that's fundamental to me is, how much am I buying into that element of my identity? If I go, wow, I am just a crazy train wreck, and I take pride in that, it's going to be hard to get past it, right? Like, it's going to be hard to think about myself as anything other than a crazy train wreck. Well, that doesn't age well, let me tell you. So when I at some point realized that I wanted to be more or different than a crazy train wreck, I went, well, then what do I want to be? And I found myself not lacking models, but not liking every model I saw either. And so when I recognized that I was at a wall, I have to change, something has to get better or different, I have to fundamentally make changes. I was casting about for a while going, well, who do I know who's recovering in a way that looks powerful, that looks smart, that looks happy, that looks joyous, that looks peaceful? And I was struggling to find models like that. And so I think had I been less desperate, I might have gone, well, to hell with it. I guess crazy train wreck girl is what it is. It's what it's going to be. And I'm going to, live fast, die young, and it'll be cute, right? No, not as cute as we perhaps might have thought. But point being, at some point I went, I may have to make it up, because I did not know very many people who were living in a way that looked like a joyful recovery to me. That doesn't mean they weren't. It means those were my perceptions. And it did, at least the advantage of that perception was it led me to go, look, if I don't have a model here for recovery, nobody else does either. I'm going to have to grow into being that person, right? I'm going to have to be the person in the room where some other woman walks in and says, that looks like a snarky old bitch, I want to talk to her. Because there wasn't that woman for me, and I wanted to be that woman for somebody else. So that model of recovery required me to look at ways in which I was buying into gendered ways in which I weakened myself. I wanted to strengthen myself at those weak points, or what felt like weak points to me. Historical context, very, very briefly. The medical model and the psychosocial models of recovery, mental health, addiction, and otherwise are badly, badly flawed. The science and the medicine behind recovery systems they are biased from everything from their sample populations, which are largely white and male and youngish, to the data that they derive from those research processes. And so it doesn't mean it's totally flawed, but it does mean it's flawed. So, I love it when people are like, it's science. Well, lots of things are science, and that doesn't make them accurate. So if a sample population of 40-year-old white men is being used to define how I should go through recovery at the age of 26 as a woman, we may have some missing points. So, but that is the data that we have. It is changing to a point. It needs to get better. But the research and the data, as well as the theory and the practice, are flawed and they're skewed. And so, people in theory, we know that recovery is different for everybody and recovery is very individual. But when you get into the recovery communities, you also hear people saying things like, stop listening for the differences, listen for the ways that you have everything in common with everyone else. Well, if I'm sitting there in a room full of old, crusty white men, and I'm thinking, okay, the ways in which we have something in common are, I too am a junkie, that's limiting. That's limiting in terms of my ability to both understand their experience, understand my own experience, speak up. Like when people say really racist, screwed up things like, take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth. I'm like, whoa, that was exciting. But that is stuff that people are still saying. And so if they're saying to me, stop talking, and I do, and it is assumed that I believe what I am being told, and I never come back, and they say sadly, how sad, she just couldn't get it, something has gone awry. So I think that in terms of looking at the practice of recovery, whether it is in a clinical setting or otherwise, the need to examine what are the assumptions about universality, again, the universality of experience and the universality and the universal applicability of recovery principles are things we really need to examine pretty carefully, because very few of those things are in fact universal. They are deeply individual. And since we don't actually have data to support the effectiveness of our strategies, and we're just acting as if it's effective, we need to really think about what is effective about it and for whom is it effective, because it turns out the data is not good on that either. So a fact of the matter is, this was really funny. A woman who had been sober for many, many years, or I thought her to be sober, got in touch with me, emailed me very late one night and said, so I would love to get sober again. I'm like, wow, okay, so you're not sober. That's something. She's like, but I can't go back to that setting because of the predation. And I was like, okay, you named it, right? You walk into that room. This is a woman who is very, very interesting and really a powerful human being, could not access what she needed to access in terms of a recovery community, because every time she walked into one of those rooms, somebody was hitting on her. And I'm like, what a pain, right? What a pain, what a pain. Aside from all the other things, that is, it's a pain. And if it means that the door is closed to her, the only door of only a few doors are open to us, right? And those doors to her were closed simply because she wanted to be left alone to get some help. That is doing the exact opposite of helping other people recover. And that is anti-service. That is anti helping people recover or become someone is, okay, sorry. So that was a very, very minor example. That said, the predation is real. It ranges from people just expressing interest in dating people to people assaulting and harassing people within the rooms. And that is not specific to any one gender, being on the recipient end of that, but it is quite common. And somebody I was chatting with, like literally went out to lunch with this dude. I'm like, he asked me where I was going to meetings of this sort or the other sort. And I said, well, I was going over here, but I found it really distressing that every dude in there was hitting on every 20-year-old who walked in. He's like, we're animals. It doesn't matter. I'm like, we're never having coffee again. Because I'm like, so you may be an animal. That's cool. I am an adult human with a consciousness and a brain, and it's pretty evolved. So did you just tell me that you can't possibly not hit on a 20-year-old girl who's vulnerable? Because if that's what you told me, go to hell. So that being what it is, I found myself really uncomfortable in settings where both I saw that, coming down from people who had, some sort of recovery. And I became aware of my own and other people's participation in that dynamic. It's not just going one way, right? Like I have to be aware also of the extent to which I don't say things because I'm afraid men will get mad at me, or I dress or act in a way that could welcome conversations I don't actually want to have. So like the reality is, Can I wear what I want, say what I want, do what I want, act how I want? Technically, but I can also anticipate certain consequences from the choices that I make, right? Like I can anticipate those. And if I get mad when those consequences are what they very predictably would be, that's on me, right? So I have to be aware of what my cultural baggage is when I walk into the room with it as well. Onward, imagining recovery, some of the things that I think about in terms of what was scary for me about recovering was yeah, how is my life going to change if I stop doing X, Y, and Z? The bigger question was, who am I going to be if I stop doing X, Y, and Z? And again, we're there at models, right? We're at models of like, do I know people who are doing this in a way that I admire, that looks joyful, that looks peaceful, that looks strong to me? And I wanted to become that model. For other people. Have I done that successfully? Doesn't matter yet. It is my striving. That is where I am trying to take myself at this point, because I'm still constantly trying to imagine a recovery that is estimable, not because I want other people's esteem, but because I like being able to look in the mirror and be like, I was pretty honest today. Not a bad day's work. Right? You know what I mean? So like, recovery to me isn't about how many days did I get sober? How many days have I done this or not done that I admire? And if that's somebody I can take out into the world, then there is the possibility that other people can say, there is hope. There is a way of being in the world that is not purely crisis, that is not disaster all the time, that is not self-destructive, that is not continually traumatized and re-traumatizing. There's a way of being in the world that I can make this work for myself. And then I can maybe show other people ways to do it and not to do it, because I can also show you how not to do this really, really effectively. Becoming gender informed in recovery. Self-awareness is a lot of this. Yeah, I talk a lot about what it's like in the community, but the key part of this is my own awareness of what gendered assumptions I walk around with. Because I cannot blame, nor do I wish to blame the world for the position that I am in. The only thing I can check is my participation in that world and how I participate in it. So my awareness about my own participation, my own benefit from privilege, my own unquestioned stances about like, this is awful and I'm just going to be mad about it and I'm going to drink, use, starve, do X, Y, and Z at it. I can't do that anymore. That's not effective. It just allows me to stay mad, which, has its own pleasures, but it isn't sustainable long-term and it isn't recovery. So examining my own assumptions about what gender has to do with my unhealth and what it has to do with my recovery. That's the first piece of this. The second piece of it is social awareness. How am I behaving in a way that is gendered, right? How am I behaving in a way to ease the discomfort of gender difference? How am I behaving in a way to make other people do what I want them to do based on gender behavior? How am I doing things that assume other people believe something about my gender that they may not, but I didn't check it out first, right? Like how many assumptions am I walking around with and then getting snippy because things didn't get communicated in the way I wanted them to get communicated? And service awareness. And again, there we're back at how can I model a recovery that maybe it's not healthy for somebody else, but I can give the model of what is healthy for me based on the wild guess that there are other people out there who aren't loving the gender dynamics in the world or the recovery models that they've been given. Last thing here, and then we will go to questions and conversation. Please do contribute, ask questions. I'm much less good at asking questions than I am in continuing a dialogue. So please, comments are welcome as well. Changing the cultures, that's not a tall order or anything like that, but examining the influence of gender on our lives is really where I have to start. If I start out there with what's wrong with you, we have an issue, right? Like I can't do anything if I'm just mad at you all the time. I do have to look at how am I participating? How am I buying in? How am I benefiting from these things? And what am I doing to unpack that myself here and from which I benefit like in a healthy way or in kind of a backwards way? Becoming a model for other people continues to be a goal of mine. And then I think this is the biggest thing for us. There are a lot of rooms in which it's not comfortable to talk about gender or, any number of other demographic issues, the cultural baggage, let's say that we're all walking around dragging with us. It's not comfortable for anybody to talk about this stuff. These aren't comfortable conversations. Nobody guaranteed me continuous comfort. I don't know about you, but like I was not guaranteed comfort for the rest of my life. I was not guaranteed a baseline of I'm happy I was guaranteed a human experience for sure. And the best I can probably do with that is do it with as much insight and as much curiosity and as much compassion as I can muster on any given day. And every day that differs every day. But the goal, if the goal for me is to raise awareness in a way that I believe to be moving, not just me, but a greater we toward a healthy place where discomfort isn't the end of the world, and where uncomfortable conversations eventually generate healing, generate equity, generate the end of isms that are damaging, destructive, and often fatal. If my goal is equity, and it is, that's going to mean I get to participate in uncomfortable conversations. I may not love what's said to me. Other people may not love what I say. Not everybody likes me. What other people think of me, though, is none of my business. What I can do is say, I'm continuing to grow, to learn, to examine my part in this world that we're in. And my hope is that we can continue having conversations about this in a way that is ultimately healing and recovery oriented for us all. So with that, we are at 1:34, and back to you, Dawn.
Oh my gosh. Oh, Marya, we need another hour just to listen to you. That was amazing. Thank you. I have so many questions. I'm not going to hog the entire remainder of this session, but okay. I'm making an assumption, so I'm going to bring out the assumption so you can address it. It's not a gendered assumption, but my assumption is that you are in a recovery community where you've done a lot of this work, and you've had a lot of these uncomfortable conversations. Do you remain in that community today?
I am part of a number of communities.
Yeah.
And so, I have a history in the 12-step community. I still participate in that to a point. I am more, because I am effectively a Buddhist, I mean, Buddhisting, that's a big word, but I'm pretty involved in the mindfulness and Buddhist approaches to recovery, which I am very much involved in. I'm very much a part of those. Yeah. And I'm also involved in the secular versions of the 12-step communities, which are burgeoning, as I think many of you know. So I'm pretty involved in that as well. So yes.
Okay, wonderful. Because I too am a person who I consider myself a member of a 12-step program that is responsible for my recovery. In the beginning, 35 years ago, I always say nobody, was telling us to go listen to a podcast and do a yoga class to get ourselves together. But I meet a lot of people who are, meet a lot of women who are either still associated in and working their program in a 12-step recovery program, or they've left it because it doesn't work for them. Fair, as you say, we're not all the same. We are not all the same. But I am a person who, a little bit like you, I like to say that I'm going to remain a member there for as long as I live, because the only requirement is that I don't want to pick up any of the drugs that I used to do. And so they can't make me do anything else other than have that desire. And sometimes I feel like I stay in that community as an agitator, because there's some agitation that needs to happen. So I appreciate meeting somebody else who can recognize and identify that within a 12-step community, for example, there are a lot of issues, and there are a lot of things that don't work for people who identify as women or non-male. So thank you for that. And I guess some of the work that I've done is tried to have conversations with women individuals who identify as female in the recovery community, a 12-step recovery community, and talk to them about their assumptions, about things that we as women could do better, because one of the assumptions, it's so interesting when you really start questioning assumptions. And one thing that I've always talked about is that as women in a 12-step program, we shouldn't expect women to give themselves over to service and 90 meetings in 90 days and all those things that are absolutely ludicrous to expect of a woman who has 4 kids, a job, maybe is a single mom, and doesn't have a car. And yet we have that expectation on her as if she's Jimmy Smith from down the street, who isn't working right now and can devote 24 hours a day to his recovery program. But I hadn't actually thought, to go beyond that. It's like the gendered expectation is that she's the one that's caring for all the kids all the time, and therefore she doesn't have more time to. Anyway, very interesting, just to keep going at that deeper level. So that was my first question. And the second question is, having read your book and knowing about your background, in a community, in a fellowship, in a recovery community or recovery communities are specifically for eating disorder recovery, where so many people do identify as female. do you have different things to kind of say about those, about assumptions and things that go on in the eating disorder community, different than in the, say, the substance use recovery community?
Great question. And absolutely. I think the baseline assumption that, a lot of what superficially informs eating disorder behavior is often an idea of body, an idea of beauty, right? So beauty standards baseline are ridiculous to begin with, right? Like, so the basic assumption there is that, all of these people have lemminged right off this cliff of there's a beauty and I need to get it. And a lot of what I want people to talk about in there is how racist their idea of beauty is, like just how freaking racist it is. So like, if we're going to unpack stuff, why don't we start with that? Like, we're talking about recovery from eating disorders as if everybody has the same concept of eating or disorder or beauty or body. All of those things are questionable assumptions that can and must be unpacked. And so I think, we're not dealing with the same sort of gender tension within those rooms,
Right.
but we are talking about largely white spaces where an assumption exists of what we are. There's that old, yeah, but what do you mean we, white boy? Like that's an assumption that, this is a we program. Well, if one more of you dudes tells me this is a we program, we got to have a chat. Because yes, I understand the side of decentering of the I, but if I continue to hear the addict mind, I'm like, this addict mind is having a really different experience than yours is. It just is. And so like that idea of we, that universality, that glossing over in cases like what you're talking about, there's a whitewashing that's going on. And I find that tiresome. And I find the idea that we agree to that problematic. So I feel like there are assumptions that need to be unpacked. They don't have to be unpacked to anyone's specifications, but I do feel like in any case, the assumption needs to be looked at. Yeah.
Thank you, Marya. Exactly. I remember in the aftermath of the George Floyd murders, we were a woman in 12-step community posted the most heart-wrenching, beautiful Facebook Live. Her name is Ariel Britt, and I think it went viral because she was talking about being in a program where people just kept saying, first of all, that what had happened was an outside issue and she had no right to bring it into the room. And second of all, that we're all more like, and it was that whole no race, no race, no gender, no age. And what trauma that is to level upon people, right? And what harm we are doing when we do that. So incredible. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. Let's go to the questions. Here's a good one. They're all good. One of our attendees asked, if and when I encounter that fella, like Marya did at the beginning, I think it's the one that said no race, no gender, no age. What can I say to counter their comments? I don't want to be silent anymore.
I think that's a great question. And we've all got different tones, right? And we've all got different presentations. What I said to him was exactly what I said, which was literally like, I find it intriguing that someone in your position is telling me what it is and isn't to be in my position, since you have no idea. A lot of those conversations, I think, can be framed more gently than I frame things. I don't think they have to be, though. Like, I don't frame things gently because I don't feel like I have to. I don't feel like I have to continue softening my point. A friend of mine, I am answering this question. What can you say to him specifically? A friend of mine said to me after he called me, he's like, God, this woman came to a meeting and she was just really upset with everybody. I'm like, why is that? And he goes, well, we were just joking. And like, oh God, don't start there. We were just joking. We were just joking. Like, we were just making these really offensive, explicit jokes about women's bodies. I'm like, odd then that a woman might have called you out on that. Was that uncomfortable? He's like, yeah, it was really uncomfortable. And I went, good, just good. I'm glad, dude, because you need to be really uncomfortable if you think it's appropriate to default to the expectation that everyone in the room will tolerate your garbage. That is the most addict attitude ever. Like, everyone stop everything. I have a drama. No. And so the expectation that we will all just tiptoe around white men having jokes, I'm tired of it too. So what can you say? I think simply calling it out in whatever your tone is, whatever your comfort level is, just be like, it's super interesting that you expect me to tolerate you, but you won't tolerate me simply questioning what you just said to me. That's all,
Great guidance. Thank you. Do you have any mental health and recovery studies or statistics to share that are about women and or non-binary individuals?
That is a great question. Right now, about non-binary individuals, there are so few studies,
Yeah.
even extant. I cannot point you to a single one. And that is not because I haven't looked. It's because they are so few and they aren't peer reviewed yet. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's a new field of inquiry, not because it should be, but because people are slow. And so, like, in terms of the research that exists on women specifically in addiction recovery, you know, there a lot of it, you can find it in the addiction science journals, which you can find on PubMed. You know, I would do keyword searches on PubMed for addiction medicine. That said, you're going to see, and I think this is perhaps the most useful point, the dramatic disparity in sample sizes and sample sources in studies on women and in studies on addicts generally. So like those sample sizes of women are tiny sample sizes. They are largely selected from an economic class of women who can afford paid treatment. I mean, so like there's a number of biases tilting it away from anything like an equitable or scientifically valid question. So that's where I'd point you is PubMed, the addiction medicine journals there. But what I'd really ask you to look at is, what are they studying? You know, who are they studying? Because that will tell you more about the study than anything I can really say.
Absolutely. And I think even though my background is research and looking at gender and behavioral health issues, and the thing, you may find the studies, but they will focus just on gender and not take into account race and age and other things.
No.
So, but there has been a call. Has been a call out to do more of this, and I think that there are people doing it. It's just going to take a while. It takes a long time for research to kind of get into the public, into the hands of the public. It has to go through quite a long process.
Yep.
Great question. Doing our own work is a beginning. And how else can we, both as women in recovery and in the mental health space, begin to decolonize and deconstruct our systems? What are some small, tangible things we can do?
You know, I love that question so much. The decolonizing of it is massive. I think, you know, that as much as anything else, a lot of what I feel like my task is to show up in rooms where I'm not welcome. That doesn't mean where I'm making other people who have chosen a safe space uncomfortable. What it means is if I walk into a room where I know there's going to be a sense of hostility around my gender, then I should be in that space so that I can field questions, so that I can navigate discomfort, so that other people can start to navigate discomfort. Because does it get tiresome? Yes. But otherwise, if we do not have those difficult conversations, nobody's going to have them, right? Like, and so, you know, what I do a lot is I spend a lot of time on the road. I'm in rural areas a lot. A lot of those rooms are male, almost exclusively. They're hetero, they're cis, they're very much like I am not, I look funny. One of these things is not like another in theirs. I can tell you right now that every time I'm in those spaces, I'm thinking to myself, how many iterations harder would this be for a person of color? You know what I mean? Like, and that just makes me angry for starters, but it does allow me to be like the chink in the armor, right, of this super male dominated, super colonialist, super divided world out there. Because, you know, when some random feminist liberal walks into a meeting in Fargo, let me tell you how well that goes. But it does start conversations, right? And if I'm okay with fielding those conversations, and I am, and it does help me, right? Like it helps me to go in and advocate for the kid in the corner who's like folded up on themselves. And I'm going, do you have anybody here? And they're like, and I'm going to go back out. And I'm like, no, let's just go to coffee. Like those are the tiny practical ways of I can be the doorway to recovery for the person who's like, there's no door. Even if I am a cis white woman, I can be the freaking loudmouth liberal to say there are other ways. There are other people. I can help you find those other people. If somebody's a person of color who walks into that room, sees only white people, I'm like, I know people of color. They can talk to you. They have given me their number and said to me, if you meet some weird little kid of color, send him my way. I'm like, that I can do. Like if I can be nothing but the conduit for greater diversity, I can be that conduit. And that's a step, right? Like it's a small step, but it's a step.
Or I have to say, somebody's just typed that she wishes, where did this go? I wish I could listen to Marya talk all day. Everything resonates so deeply.
Thank
you know what Chris from Hazelland said, you're going to love her. And I was like, okay. And oh my gosh, you are fun. Like all I want to do is go to a meeting in Fargo with you, like right now. Like how far is Fargo? Please let us know if you're ever on this side of the country. Lisa and I at least are on the West Coast. If you're up around Vancouver, Seattle or anything, we'll find you and we'll go to a meeting. We'll find that meeting.
Amazing.
Love it. Have you, I think we may have had the answer to this already, but I want to ask it in respect to the person that's asked it. Have you found any recovery spaces that feel safer for you as a woman? She recovers, is this space for me?
Yes, I have. A lot of the spaces I go to these days are online, partly simply because de facto they are more diverse of perspective, of background, of demographic, of opinion, but I'll tell you, even there, like I'm giving a lecture at some ginormous thing and some dude texts in. I'm like, I'm the keynote speaker, man. He texted, you're not hard to look at. And I'm like, excuse me, everyone. And I literally stopped my lecture. And I was like, I just want to thank the gentleman from Alberta for letting me know I'm not hard to look at. Keep it up. Because that's what I mean by call it out. Like, do you think you get to do that in the text? You don't grab my ass in a meeting. Excuse me. Anyway, so while we're at it, like, I think the sort of the spaces that are comfortable for me, yeah, I do find, I find the online rooms simply de facto more diverse. I find meditation meetings really grounding. And as somebody just mentioned NYC has a lot of diverse rooms. That is true. It isn't purely just representation. It's also a sense of equity that I seek, right? There have been rooms that were all men that felt equitable to me. And there have been rooms that were all women that felt very, very hierarchical. I'm definitely not just talking about a male-female split or a male domination thing. I am talking also about the deeply embedded sexism in female-only communities, the women's-only meetings where I go and I'm not a mom, I'm not Edina Wino, I don't have the right car, I'm their husband looked at me funny, and I'm like, I don't want your cultural baggage in this room. You know what I mean? And so those are the spaces that are problematic too. So it's not strictly representational diversity. It is also diversity of perspective and more than anything, a sense of equity in the room where people maybe even the meeting itself or the room itself has done its work around its lack of equity. So yeah.
Wonderful. This directly from a participant. Marya, I love your work beyond. Thank you for this beautiful, thought-provoking presentation. Might you be able to give me some advice about your experience with feeling invalidated as it pertains to some of your experiences navigating through the mental health medical world as a woman? As a Black woman with a mental condition, I found it hard to even receive a diagnosis for anything other than being depressed.
That's for sure. So the question is so important that, from a baseline, if I walk into a clinic, I think of Foucault, if any of you have read The Birth of the Clinic, that's a pretty fascinating text that anybody might resonate with. I think when I walk into a clinic, I am suspect, as is a person of color, as is a Black woman walking into a clinic. There is so much over-determination just by walking in. If I walk into an ER, all they do is I have gone into an ER and they have refused to treat me until they had to intubate me because they're like, she's just overdosing. And eventually my friend who took me in was like, why are you assuming she's even done drugs in the last 22 years? And the guy's like, well, look at her, covered with tattoos. And the guy's like, legit, she's been sober since before you were born, kiddo. You know what I mean? So that's the sort of thing is the overdetermination when you walk into that clinic of she must want, she must have, those are all value judgments of this is what's wrong with you. And that's what's wrong with you. And we know. And so in terms of the problematization of the situation is to me, a deep and profound paternalism in medical care, not just medical care, but mental health care too, even if it's non-medical, right? The assumption of you must be the problem. If we can help you with your problem, that is you, instead of being like, well, now here is a woman who is clearly dealing with structural and systemic racism. That's not the assumption that gets made when you walk in the room, right? I want that to be the assumption. I want somebody to hype up and say, okay, statistically speaking, you're already dealing with a bad day. You know what I mean? I want somebody to have that assumption when you walk in the room. I want somebody to say, statistically speaking, you may be dealing with these medical issues. What's your blood pressure? What's your blood sugar? How can you see? Are you comfortable? Like, I want those to be the defaults. They aren't the defaults right now any more than they are when I walk in, right? So I get different assumptions. I walk into a clinic and they're like, do we take you directly to the psych ward, or do you need to stop off and get weighed first or some, you know what I mean? So like, none of it has to do with care. All of it has to do with assumption. All of it has to do with, this is what we know, and you can't prove us wrong. And I'm like, I will absolutely, I've been getting care solely at Planned Parenthood for years, simply because like, I'll walk into Planned Parenthood with a cold, you know, I mean, just be like, I definitely have a cold and I don't want to go to the doctor. They're like, that's cool, take Benadryl. You know what I mean? So like, but just to avoid the strict paternalism. And there is the systemic problems of racism under that paternalism. There is a matter of ownership. There is a matter of body autonomy that is not being regarded in medical care. And you're dealing with that in many levels. And so are a lot of folks. So what can we do? I don't know. As we've talked about, advocate for yourself. But what does that look like? That needs to be another conversation that we all need to have. So thank you for the question. It's an important one.
It's a very important question. Thank you. So here's one. This might be a little off topic, but there's really not. There's no outside issues here. That's the thing, right? This might be a little off topic, but what are your thoughts on labels? I find there's a lot of talk about removing stigmatizing labels for substance users like addict or junkie. And while I understand this is critically important for when speaking to or treating others, but I find it empowering to reclaim what being an addict is. And I prefer this term to self-identify. Great question.
Awesome. Like, my question on labels, I don't love labels only because, well, it's not that I don't love them. Here's 2 points on that. One of them is on labels. And that is that if I deeply identify as an addict, which I don't, I do deeply identify as a woman. I do deeply identify as a teacher, as a writer, as a daughter, as a sister, right? Like, there are identifications that feel real, profound, bone deep to me. Addict isn't one of them. Am I an addict? For sure. Am I comfortable in a room saying I'm an addict? Yeah, that doesn't bother me. Outside of there, that isn't an identity deep level label for me. Others are, though. So labels themselves, I think they help tell us who we are, right? There was a time in my life when saying I have this diagnosis felt important. It felt key to my identity. It just doesn't anymore. Like, because we evolve, we change. Addict, is it a fact? For sure. Am I short? Yes, also a fact, not a major piece of my identity, right? Like, so whatever it is that feels real, that feels core, keep it, roll with it, right? Like, you may need it forever, you may not, right? The second thing I want to say to that, though, is the question around stigma. I think stigma is the most overblown problem we have. Like, raising awareness about stigma, I do not care if the world stigmatizes mental health issues. I don't care. Them not stigmatizing health issues doesn't save anybody's life, because as to the question somebody just asked, if it doesn't change care, doesn't make any material difference. So like, stigmatizing me by calling me an addict, I don't care. Did you get me my care or not? Like, stigmatizing me by saying I have a mental health diagnosis. Well, if you have an opinion about my mental health diagnosis, that's on you. If you can provide me care for that, good. If you can't, get out of my hair. You know what I mean? So like, I feel like stigma isn't a thing. I don't feel like it matters. We've poured billions of dollars into awareness campaigns about stigma. No fewer people are dying because of that. And that concerns me a lot. So, yeah.
Wow, that's very provocative. I want to think some more about that. I definitely love what you said about labels. And it was very interesting for somebody who comes from having had an identity as an addict for so long. When we started changing the language, I was like, what? And it was just, the people that were suggesting we changed it did not leave any room for the idea that addict might be an empowering identity for some people. And so it was interesting to watch the thou shall never say these words again. And then people used their voice. People were advocates for themselves. And they said, wait, hold on a minute.
That means
alcoholic, addict, whatever it is, this matters to me. This is what gives me life. And therefore you're not going to take that away from me. But that means that I get to claim that for myself. I don't get to call you an addict or an alcoholic or other people or talk about them. So yeah, language is important, but that's really, really, really interesting. Last question. I think maybe we have a little bit of an answer to this. Somebody's asking, are you aware of any training one can take about creating more inclusive and culturally sensitive recovery spaces?
I am not aware of training, but I would bounce that back maybe to Dawn and She Recovers. That training, I believe, exists. I do not know where. So what do you know about that?
So we do a number of things. We in our own community, we've had a number of webinars and presentations. We've had a critical conversation about healing the effects of racism for Black women in recovery. We're in the process of trying to identify funding so that we can hold training for volunteers and all members of our community on those exact things. We have had other previous Mental Health Mondays on that topic. So whoever asked that question, if you want to keep your eyes open on the Facebook page where this is streaming, we can pop some of the resources that we have in there. But it's definitely something that is part of our strategic planning for next year, is to just really pull together the different strands of pieces that we've done over the past about 3 years and really create something cohesive and be able to offer it not just to our organization, but hopefully to others as well. So thanks for the question.
Yeah.
Marya, you're a delight. Whoa, you're just what a great way to start the week. And I'm delighted that you took time to be here with us today. And I hope that we can have you back again, either here virtually or someday on a stage, because we do some stage things too, right?
Good. Bring me out. I'll be there. Yep.
We did our questions. Thank you so much for your time, for your heart, for your experience. Thank you to those who make this series possible. That's all of these wonderful team members. And thanks most importantly to all of you who showed up here today, both on Facebook and here in the webinar. Thank you for bringing forward your questions and for listening. We truly are stronger together.